I am James Payne, and we are at the Makers Fair in downtown Los Angeles. Well, today I've brought a very limited edition of 24 images from a 46-year-long, three-dimensional photo documentary of environmental portraits. And the subjects of my portraits are my friends and my family in their homes, and they're all photographed in whatever environment they've chosen to create in their lives. I was a photo major in college, and my final semester I was doing two projects. One was a documentary and the other was called Experimental Camera. And I was struggling to find subject matter that was engaging, basically. And eventually, due to a comment that was made to me by Bruce Davidson, I decided to combine the two projects, and I went back and re-photographed the people in 3D. And that documentary was for a class. The class ended in a few months, and I was frustrated by the difficulty with showing it. So I decided to expand the project for 40 years and presumed that by then the technology would have evolved enough that I wouldn't have to worry about how to display it. And 46 years later, I'm still waiting for that solution and still photographing my friends and family. I'm now calling it American Portraits. Well, just because when the project was first conceived, it was only going to be for a few months long, but when I had the idea of expanding it into a longer time frame, I thought wherever I went in my life, wherever I worked, if I moved, anything that happened, the project would follow me, because I was only photographing friends and family and people I worked with, and who knew where I would wind up going. So I presumed I'd stay in the US and thought, well, it'll just be American Portraits. I've never done anything else that was conceived as a long-term project or anything that I had any mental frame around. There are other things I shoot that I've done for a long time, but they don't have a theme. When I was a teenager, I was ill a lot. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 3. And they told my parents that I would never live to see 21, because in the 50s there weren't a lot of ways to treat diabetes. So my ambition to focus on school and a future didn't exist. And I was instead focused on packing as much experience into my life as I could, which meant that every day I got on the school bus, and when the school bus delivered everybody to school, I walked around the corner and hitchhiked to the train station and took that into downtown Chicago, and I explored. One of the places that I could get into at no cost and that was warm was the Art Institute of Chicago. I had 6 months before I would go blind, so my interest in visual art exploded, because I was afraid that I would be blind very soon. And that's when I suddenly decided that photography, which was a more natural medium, I'm not a painter, I needed to dive into as quickly as I could. The state of Illinois offered me a grant to go back to school so I would be able to have a job after I went blind. And I spent that grant on going to school to study photography, which I realize is counterintuitive, but my expectation was that I would still die young. Well, before I went back to school, I was largely doing nature landscapes. That was just available to me, and living in Illinois, and there's a lot of weather and other things that produce a constant variety of landscapes. So I was just doing nature. And if anything, I was avoiding photographing people at all, probably out of my own sense of isolation from the greater body of humanity. And when I went back to school, I took a trip to New York as part of the curriculum. And while I was there isn't a lot of nature, so I just started doing street photography. and there was just so much visual interest of people on the streets and the colors of New York City. And so I came back with just, a bag full of Kodachrome slide film, and when I had it processed, discovered that abstract nature landscapes were no longer interesting to me, and I just wanted to photograph people. So a semester or so later, I took an experimental camera class. One of the things that I explored was 3D photography, and simultaneously I was doing a documentary photo class and decided to photograph all my neighbors in their homes. So both of those projects were going forward, but neither of them were gaining any traction in my own heart, because the 3D photography was fence posts and trees and things that just seemed so overdone already. And the black and white interiors I was doing of my friends in their apartments for the documentary class also seemed trite. So on another field trip that I took with a bunch of my college classmates, I had the good fortune to have Bruce Davidson, who's a world-renowned documentary photographer, ask if he could look at my box of work and tell me, quote, "These prints suck." And of course, I responded that black and white was a foreign language to me, and he was go back and reshoot these in color. So I went back to the town that I was living in, scheduled myself to reshoot all those people in color, and as I headed out the door for the first shot, I noticed my 3D rig standing adjacent to the door, so I took it with me and did the first reshoot in 3D. When the film came back, I felt like I had been dropped back into the room because it was so immersive. And this project was born on that day. Well, when I learned how to do 3D, I was given the theory in a class of how to do it and what the principle of it was, with the average human's eyes being 2.5 inches apart. So I went out and looked at what I could find in the used market. There was no internet at the time, and I was living in a small town in southern Illinois. So there was not much available, and I decided that there had to be some way I could do it without spending all that money. So I took a little piece of plywood, 2.5 inches by 10 inches. I cut another piece that was about 1 inch by 10 inches. I glued the one flapped up on the other. I put a tripod thread in the bottom of it, and I drew 2 lines on the back of the backboard and aligned my camera, took a picture, slid it over and took another, and it worked. The pictures were really immersive, and I was free of that expense. I was living in a married student housing facility that was part of the university that I was attending, and I had the good fortune to be the building inspector. So people would call me if their stove broke or their bathtub blocked up, and I was the guy that would come and inspect and then order repairs or whatever. So I had gotten to know a lot of the tenants. So I thought, well, these are interesting people. I would go into one apartment, the walls would be completely bare. There would be very little furniture, and the family would be from Nepal. And I would go into the next one, and the walls were completely covered with artwork and drawings, and they had children. This is the Chung family from Taiwan, and they are the first photo in the series. I had already photographed them in black and white in 2D, and when I decided to go back and restart in 3D and in color, they were the first family to respond to my invitation. This is the Hamadi family from Argentina. After I had composed the shot, he asked if he could look through the camera to see what I was including in the composition. He then went into the bedroom and came out with his little boxes full of adult toys to place in the foreground of the coffee table. I find this one interesting because of the historical
visibility. This was taken in 1976, and you can see the American bicentennial flag displayed on the wall, which was celebrating the 200th year since the founding of the United States. I also think it's interesting because of the other details it reveals about their lives, like the Planters Peanuts and Jack Daniels containers in the foreground and their very messy children's bedroom in the background. This photo's always been interesting to me just because it's such a historical snapshot of a family. They have their furniture and everything from that time period, but you also see that he's wearing bell-bottoms and an afro hairstyle, and that the captain and Tennille are on the television set when they were a popular contemporary TV program. This is Darrell Little and his son. Darrell chose to sit in that particular chair because he had just received his stuffed fish from the taxidermist that day and was very proud of it. I also find, of course, the rug pattern and the conflicting couch pattern to be interesting, not to mention the white television, which probably has about a 10 or 11 inch screen. These were just very typical neighbors from the 70s, but the environment is interesting because you can see so many of the stylistic artifacts from that era. The macrame plant hangers, the lamp hanging over the coffee table, the striped couch, their clothing, his mustache. It's just one detail after another that date this to the mid-70s. This is a family from Nepal. And the thing that I found interesting about this photo was that there was only one thing hanging on the wall. I asked them about it, and they said that in their country, it was not typical for people to hang objects all over their walls.
So one of the things I realized as the building inspector, and I got to meet all these people, is that there was so much diversity in the way people had created these environments out of basically identical apartments. And the rules of the institution were that you couldn't paint the walls, so you could hang art on the walls, or you could, arrange your furniture, but you weren't allowed to make any permanent changes. And yet these places were all so different because the families were from all over the world, and each cultural habit and individual preference of the families would turn these into really unique spaces, which made it a lot of fun for me, and it made it real interesting to just explore how different they all were. Well, at the end of the semester, I turned the project into both classes, both the documentary and the experimental camera, and they both had the same professor, so I felt like I wasn't cheating. And that completed, my assignments to graduate. He gave me an A in one of them and a D in the other. I don't even remember which one he gave me the higher grade in, but that was his way of thanking me for turning in one project to two classes. But at any rate, I graduated, I moved back to Chicago, and I tried to show the project to people, but I was struggling with the fact that it was hard to display. And I had built a cabinet that contained 15 viewers and a light box. And, I would take it out of my home and put it in my car in Chicago when it was 22 below zero, and it would freeze up. I was worried the fluorescent tubes would implode. And I would take it to someone's home, and then it would become all condensed water on the lenses from going back into a warm space. And it just became such a struggle to show it that I decided it wasn't worth the effort. So I took the slides out of the cabinet with the intention of throwing them away and just being done with that particular part of my history. And as I was walking across the garage to throw them in the trash, this little voice in the back of my head said, well, what if you did it for 40 years? You'd have this slice of American history in 3D. And by then, 40 years from now, they'll have solved that viewing problem. So I was like, oh, that's an interesting idea. Because I was in my mid-20s, and I figured I'd be 65 approximately when that completed, and it would kind of reflect whatever path my life took, and not knowing whether I would wind up,
as the president of General Motors and living in Southfield, or whether I would wind up homeless in some park. And the photos would just reflect whoever I got to meet and interact with as I went forward. And I started forward like, 40 years, no big deal. Of course, a few years later, I was thinking that I was probably insane for having picked such an unlikely number, but I had already started forward and just continued. When I was living in Chicago, I took some classes about Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, and met the monk, and he was very respectful, as traditional in his career. So I asked him if he would be willing to pose for a picture, and he agreed. So when I got there, he wanted to be photographed in the temple at his altar, and we did that shot with him in full ceremonial robes, and it was a very elegant shot. And then as we were completing that, I asked him if he would like to do one in his home, because I had become aware that he lived in the adjacent facility. And he thought that was a great idea, and he asked me if I would do one of him in his meditation room. So we went into the interior, and he took me down the hallway to where he had built this room that he used strictly to meditate in. So he showed me that that would be the room, and then he went off down the hallway. So while he was gone, I set up the camera and composed the shot. And then when he returned, to my surprise, he was wearing a three-piece gray suit and a tie. And he quickly knelt on the prayer mat and posed for me. And I was just completely surprised, because that was about the last thing I expected at that moment. That's the thing about the project. Because I choose not to direct, because I feel as if it's going to be called a documentary, it has to be something that reflects reality. And of course, that's a nuanced issue, because if people know that someone's coming to photograph them, they can present themselves in a way that isn't their normal reality. But most people tend not to. They tend to be fairly honest about reflecting how they live. So I was working with an animation cameraman, and I asked him if I could photograph he and his family, and he agreed. And I explained to him that the rules were that I wasn't going to direct the shot, and I wasn't going to tell them where to sit or how to dress or anything else, but that what I was looking for was something that would tell me something about who they were as people through the choices they made for the photo. So normally a family will pick something that they have in common. Oh, they all like to watch TV, they'll make popcorn and sit on the couch together. In this particular case, when I walked into their house, they had arranged a shot, but it was actually 4 separate portraits in one shot, because the son had set up his Apple IIe computer before the Macintosh had ever been released. His daughter was sitting there with her Miss Piggy doll. His wife had set up a sewing machine on the same table. And Nick, my friend, had arranged a massage table, a squirt bottle of oil, a manual on how to give a massage, and he was standing there in a Speedo. And I was just completely dumbstruck by how different this photo was going to be, and just the hilarity of what Nick had chosen for himself. The project started as this very primitive and basic technique of the so-called cha-cha, where you shoot 2 photos from 2.5 inches apart and try to keep the bottom and the back of the camera relatively plano parallel. But I never had a stereo camera, at least not at that point. The project, by chance, became so dramatic because I was shooting interiors. I was shooting with a 20mm lens to get some of the room information and not just have headshots. And that put everything into focus, which is something your eye can't do. And it also exaggerates the amount of space between the objects in the room. So I was, from the beginning, getting a hyper 3D that had a lot more detail in it than most of the traditional 3D I had ever seen. And I thought, well, why change that? And again, I could have gone out and had a camera built custom. I think Nikon quoted me $33,000 when I asked to do that. But I was already functioning just fine with my little piece of wood, and I just kept shooting. And then as the project began to gain historical depth, once I was 10 years into it, I realized that it would be smart not to change anything about the way I shot, so that there wouldn't be an evolution of technology. It would just continue to be consistent and relatively unnoticed. I light all the photos too, but I do it in a way so you don't notice that I lit it. I have come up with many ideas for other 3D projects, but this one has kind of become my albatross. It's 45 years into it. This is the focus of what I'm trying to complete and find a home for, because it is a piece of American history in a way, a visual history. I've been working on street photography because my interest in, people and the environment is expressed in two ways. The street photography is all two-dimensional, particularly the way I shoot 3D, you can't capture motion. So in my interior portraits in 3D, everybody has to hold still between the two exposures, or I get a lot of visual chaos. Whereas on the street, it's all motion, and I have to just capture. It's more like hunting, whereas the 3D project is more like farming. So I have those two projects. But the street stuff does not have a real theme behind it. It's just whatever I see that delights me so that I choose to capture it. Yeah, well, there are actually a lot of people in the project that I have photographed more than once. In the very beginning, in the 1970s, I photographed my mother in the home I grew up in. And, she's sitting very formally in the living room, which is kind of classic for her generation of how they would present themselves in their home. So she's very nicely dressed, and it's a very formal pose. Years later, I photographed she and her husband, my stepfather, in their home, and he was a very humorous, very relaxed, very friendly man, and the pose is much more casual. They're at their dining room table with a set of cards, and I believe we were in the middle of a game of pinochle when he decided that's when he wanted the photo taken. And then years later, I photographed my mother before she passed away in 2015 in her home, her retirement home. So she shows up in the project many times. But I also have my brother and his wife when they first got married and they didn't have children. I have them again a few years later with their two daughters. I have them again many years later with their two adult daughters, and then one more with their two adult daughters and the two grandchildren of the older daughter. Let's just click through a few. I'll do multiple passes here. All right. 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's try that again. 1, 2, 3. And again, 1, 2, 3.